Or if it's better than music, it's jazz.
Well, hello and welcome once again, this time to episode 2 of year 2 of The Backward Glance, a retro look at some of my personal favorite episodes from 4 of the most iconic Star Trek series of yesteryear: Classic Trek, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. I'm your speaker and fellow Star Trek fan, Lal Winstrom, on this end, and in this episode of The Backward Glance, we're going to join Captain Kathryn Janeway as she plays referee to 2 feuding members of the Q Continuum, as they litigate the question, what is the value of life when it has no end? Along the way, we'll twist things up with a jazzy selection from the eminent saxophonist Nelson Rangel in his cover of the great Michael Jackson's Human Nature. Let's begin now and follow the crew of the USS Voyager on their journey to confront an immortal being's very real desire to end it all in Death Wish. A comet hurtles through space on an awkward and apparently random course, enticing the crew of the USS Voyager to begin an investigation. Captain Janeway orders a piece of the comet beamed aboard for study, and, to no one's expectation, instead of a core fragment, a man is beamed aboard instead. He identifies himself simply as Q, which prompts the now worried Captain Janeway to declare Red Alert. The man invites her to lunch and, in a display of abnormal ability, teleports her from the bridge to the crew lounge, where he reintroduces himself to the captain personally and thanks her for releasing him from his confinement within the comet. Unbeknownst to him, Captain Janeway already knows who he is, or at least she believes she does, and has no desire to suffer his presence on her ship gladly. But the unwelcome guest informs her that she has confused him with someone else, and proceeds to utter a manifesto which she claims they'll understand. In another display of abnormal power, he tries to kill himself, but instead erases all of the male members of the crew from existence wherever they may be on the ship. Captain Janeway is incensed and demands that he return them immediately. Q tries to do so, but is clearly, as he says, out of practice, and fails to return Voyager's male crew members after repeated attempts. He teleports Janeway to the bridge and bids her goodbye, but she again more insistently demands he bring her crew back to whole, which prompts him to ponder who has more up-to-date interactions with humans. With his question in a flash of light appears another being like himself who demands to know what trouble he's caused this time. And thus enters the Q whom we Trekkies have come to know and love, or hate, as that Q, the one who has caused so much pain and suffering throughout the universe and made himself an annoyance and nuisance to the crew of the USS Enterprise D on so many occasions, and briefly to then Commander Benjamin Sisko and the crew of Deep Space Nine. This is the Q that Captain Janeway at last understands is the one that every ranking Starfleet officer has been briefed about should he appear, and for whom a red alert was declared at the mere mention of his name. What an honor! And Q takes it as such. With a snap of his fingers, he restores the men of Voyager back to existence, and then insists that his fellow Q leave with him at once. The new Q refuses and demands asylum from Captain Janeway, which begins a minor struggle between them that Voyager becomes an unwilling pawn of. The second Q takes the ship to, as he calls them, old hiding places to which he's run from his people in the past, including the subatomic particle level and even the birth of the universe itself. And in a kind of running joke that the episode takes advantage of to harken back to the days when Star Trek holiday decorations were popular with the fandom, the second Q reduces Voyager to the size of a Christmas ornament and tethers the ship to a Christmas tree. All of these attempts at dodging and ducking his fellow Q fail, and eventually he and Voyager are found. The second Q threatens to stalemate his counterpart for eternity, which prompts Captain Janeway's immediate ire and intervention. To keep her ship from becoming forever trapped between these two immortal titans' struggle, she relents to the second Q's request and announces a hearing to judge the merits of his asylum demand. And thus events begin. Now, at this point, I think it a good idea to offer a brief explanation of the beings who are known as Q and what their appearance usually means in Star Trek. As you've probably observed, this is not the first time members of what is called the Q have been seen in the Star Trek universe. Indeed, the very first appearance of these super beings was in the pilot episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, Encounter at Farpoint, where the Q we've come to know so well first meets Captain Picard and the crew of the Enterprise D and proceeds to test their worthiness to travel space and encounter the unknown. Collectively, they are known as the Q, the Continuum, or more formally as the Q Continuum. And these are interesting demarcations because separately they are also known as Q, with no other individuated names or characterizations that would tell an outsider what the differences between them are. And so you can see the reason for the misidentification which Janeway commits at the beginning of Death Wish. Yet they are, in fact, an evolved society of individuals who appear on the mortal planes of existence in separate and distinct forms, which lesser evolved beings can appreciate at their level of understanding. Thus, we have seen members of the Continuum appear as males and females, for example, and not simply in the biological sense, but also in what we would deem the psychological and emotional sense. As mentioned, the Continuum, both collectively and individually, is extremely powerful, able to manipulate time, space, matter, and energy in fantastic ways that, to us, would indeed seem to be godlike and omnipotent, or near enough. They are capable of such feats as teleportation, both of themselves and others, telekinesis, telepathy, the conversion of matter into other forms, or even the creation of matter ex nihilo, that is, matter from nothing. They are able to travel through time, as we see with this Q taking Voyager back to the very instance of creation itself. All of these abilities and more showcase the power of Q. But what we also see on display nearly every time a Continuum representative appears is a certain level of arrogance and condescension toward lesser beings, even a level of impatience and paternalism that tells such beings, in effect, that because I am more evolved, I know better than you, and thus I have the right to dictate the terms on which you will live, and the standards by which you will be judged worthy to live.
7 years ago, I said we'd be watching you, and we have been. Hoping that your ape-like race would demonstrate some growth, give some indication that your minds had room for expansion. But instead of using the last 7 years to change and to grow, you have squandered them.
We are what we are, and we're doing the best we can. It is not for you to set the standards by which we should be judged.
Oh, but it is, and we have. Time may be eternal, Captain, but our patience is not.
Indeed, the Q have been taken to task for this arrogance by mortals before, including Captains Janeway and Picard.
The vaunted Q Continuum, self-anointed guardians of the universe. How dare you come aboard this ship and endanger this crew with your personal tug of war?
Your arrogant pretense at being the moral guardians of the universe strikes me as being hollow, Q. I see no evidence that you are guided by a superior moral code, or any code whatsoever. You may be nearly omnipotent, and I don't deny that your parlor tricks are very impressive. But morality, I don't see it. I don't acknowledge it, Q. I would put human morality against the Q's any day.
Yet, at the same time as simple mortals might see the Q as arrogant and condescending, there is a type of parentalism evident in their behavior toward lesser beings, that suggests they are adamant that such creatures not become complacent and satisfied with where they are on the evolutionary scale. And such evidences do exist, such as Q introducing humanity to the Borg, or his testing of Picard in All Good Things, as he challenges the captain to understand and resolve a time paradox that will destroy Earth and all of the human race if it is not set right. Now that you understand the Q continuum, from here on I will distinguish between the two continuum citizens of Deathwish by referring to the Q we're already familiar with as Q, and our guest Q by the name he eventually chooses to call himself later in the episode, Quinn, just to avoid confusion. Quinn next appears to Tuvok and asks the lieutenant to represent him at his hearing. Tuvok at first questions this request, telling Quinn that he has no legal expertise, but Quinn reminds Tuvok that he does understand Federation asylum practices and, more importantly, that Vulcans themselves approve of ritual suicide in cases of old age infirmity. Now let's stop right there for a moment. At the time of this episode in February 1996, this was the first instance I'd heard of Vulcan culture approving of any form of suicide, be it from old age or any other reason. Indeed, even as recently at the time of the TNG episode Sarek, in which the titular character suffered from a terminal neurological disease known as Bendai syndrome, there was no talk of ending his life via artificial means. Nor was there any such thought articulated when Sarek appeared for the final time many months later in the TNG episode Unification, during which it was implied, at least, Sarek died of natural causes related to his disease. And still to this day I am not aware of any source speaking of Vulcans practicing such a life-ending decision as ritual suicide. So, for me, at least, the inclusion of this seemingly throwaway line in Deathwish, it has some hefty implications for Vulcan culture, and I'm wondering, as I did at the time, if the writers well considered that before having Tuvok affirm the practice as the ranking Vulcan on board Voyager. If you, dear listeners, do know of any such source or sources that mention this notion of ritual suicide amongst the Vulcan people, please enlighten me. I would like to read it, and feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section. Now, this is not the first time, though, that modern Star Trek has addressed euthanasia. In the TNG episode Half a Life, we are introduced to the people of Kaylon 2 and their cultural practice known as the Resolution, during which a person is bound by the traditional requirements of their species to commit ritual suicide once they reach 60 years of age, that is, 60 years of age. Quite young, relatively, even by human standards, and certainly by the standards of the 24th century, in which we see people living well into their centenarian years. It is a practice that has endured amongst their people for centuries, and because of which a diplomatic crisis erupts, due to the Kaylon's leading scientist getting close to the time of his own resolution. Now, I'm not going to go full bore into Half a Life, but I would encourage you to watch or rewatch that episode, because I think its take on the euthanasia angle is quite different from that which we see in Deathwish, because in that episode we are given a very life-affirming look at what age and wisdom and contribution mean, which is strongly contrasted, I think, against the idea that just because one reaches a certain epoch of existence, there is nothing left to do. To get back to the episode, though, nevertheless, a surprise Quinn does counter Tuvok by telling him that immortality has its own set of vulnerabilities and weaknesses that a mortal like Tuvok simply cannot appreciate. a loss of curiosity, a loss of desire to grow and change. He even tells Tuvok that the Continuum is not a race of omnipotent beings, no matter what his people may want lesser beings to think. That near omnipotence, that immortality, Quinn argues, is their vulnerability. And it is this foundation, or rather the cracks in that foundation, that Quinn wants Tuvok to take a philosophical and legal jackhammer to during the hearing. The hearing begins with some very standard arguments made by both Qs on both sides of the debate. Q argues for the sanctity of life, a common argument of those who do not favor the right of an individual to end their life on their own terms and in their own way. Q argues that Quinn is pursuing his own selfish interests by wanting to commit suicide, again another common argument that implies that those who carry out such a deed will leave behind others who will suffer their death even more than they presently suffer in life. He goes on to argue that immortality is in fact one of the defining characteristics of being a Q, and that to deny it by desiring self-destruction is to invite social anarchy. Now this, I think, is actually one of the more unique arguments that Q makes against Quinn's desire to die, because it touches at the very heart of the Continuum's concern, the unknown. In this case, the unknown of permanent non-existence, something the Continuum has not dealt with since the New Era, as Quinn himself calls it, began. Now again, let's break off here for a second, because to me, this notion of the New Era deserves a little mention. By calling it the New Era, Quinn subtly tells us that not only were the Q at one time mortal, and thus capable of experiencing death, but that since becoming virtually immortal, and being so for so long, they no longer even remember or know what it means to die, and this frightens them. Death, permanent death, frightens beings who seemingly have absolute mastery of space, matter, time, and energy. Permanent death disrupts the very nature, the very meaning of their self-defined identity, the Q Continuum, a nature that goes on and on and on without end. And when seen from that point of view, Quinn's death wish represents a fundamental defilement of that nature, doesn't it? It then becomes not a wonder that the Q so aggressively want to put a muzzle on his desire, but it also circles us back to what Quinn told Tuvok previously.
We may appear omnipotent to you, but believe me, we're not.
Quinn's own arguments interweave against Q's, that an individual Q is held responsible for the path his life will take, and that such a path is still his responsibility no matter what the majority may believe or desire for it. That, as stated, his death will force the Continuum to confront the unknown for the first time since they as a people achieved immortality, and, in the process, some form of superconsciousness that transcends the individual alone. Through Tuvok, Quinn counters Q's argument that the state, in this case the Continuum, has the right to interfere in that life path simply because his motivation to end his life contradicts the Continuum's desire to prolong it. Also through Tuvok, Quinn questions the validity of the Continuum's power to execute other Q, and whether or not their deaths also represent not only a contradiction, but a disruption in Continuum society, that is, a disruption to their immortality. Now, in their own ways, almost all of these talking points are real-world arguments to be made, on both sides. Arguing in the negative, that is, that Quinn does not have the right to kill himself, Q's case, we find the following. There is the sanctity and majesty of life argument, the selfishness of suicide, and the potential harm it does to those left behind. Even the supposed social anarchy that might ensue if masses of individuals begin to accept that the majesty and dignity of life can be reduced and cheapened to mere whimsical choice. On the other side, arguing in the affirmative, Quinn's case, we see the rejection of the principle that the state should have the absolute power to dictate life and death only as it sees fit. That an individual should, in fact, have the right and the power to determine where, when, and why their life should end, regardless of whomever and whyever someone else believes it should not. Now, there are staggering implications here to both sets of arguments that are subtly woven into the episode to make one consider and even question their own assumptions, no matter where they may fall on the subject. Now, because Q has suffered a minor setback to his case, he decides to call other witnesses, and thus enter Maury Ginsburg, Sir Isaac Newton, and our own beloved commander of the USS Enterprise D, William Thomas Riker himself. Their introduction into the hearing is meant to bolster Q's case that Quinn has influenced countless lives and events across the universe, and therefore his own life should not be so easily forfeit and cast away. But Tuvok and Quinn have a counter-argument of their own, which itself can have real-world implications. That is, Quinn's quality of life. At Tuvok's request, Judge Janeway allows Quinn to reproduce the conditions of the roving comet that he's been imprisoned within for the last 300 years. He does so, zapping himself, Tuvok, Janeway, and Q inside. It doesn't take long for any of them to realize the horribleness of this confinement, even as Quinn asserts that he will never change his mind about destroying himself, no matter what the Continuum does to him. Janeway is visibly disturbed and wants out as soon as humanly possible. Once back in the hearing room, though it is clear that she sympathizes with Quinn's suffering and the conditions of his punishment, Janeway is still not convinced that his reasons for wanting to die can justify his asylum demand, and she asks him to demonstrate that he is in fact suffering, but in ways that she as a mortal woman can appreciate. Tuvok requests a recess to decide how to respond, and in the next scene we find him expressing doubt that Janeway has been convinced. Tuvok tells Quinn that he finds his desire to end his life illogical, which happily surprises Quinn as a Q, because Q are rarely surprised by anything in the universe anymore. But Quinn counters that by suggesting that life as a Q is not so illustrious as a mortal may at first be tempted to believe. This notion prompts Tuvok to suggest, let's see what life in the Continuum is like, what it is really like, a view that Tuvok believes could possibly be their trump card to winning the case.